Good morning. This is a winter review video to answer some questions. Specifically, a student asked me some questions. So let's get right into it. The topic of World War II, reviewing for the test. Okay, a student asked me to review the following. They were asking me about these questions. What are the Nuremberg trials? What about the definitions? I don't understand all the definitions. What was the Holocaust? What was the Yalta Conference? What happened to Czechoslovakia during World War II at the beginning, before the war started? What do we need to know about the Canadian Charter of Rights for the test? What do we need to know on the test about societal changes in Canada? And what do we need to know on the test about the timeline of World War II? All right, let's get into it. So I'm making this video to answer these questions that the student asked. The answers are also on some of my other videos, but this is specifically about answering these questions. So this is a timeline that's on one of the other videos, and this is a timeline on one of the other videos. So specifically about the causes of World War I and what was a lead up to World War I. You'd want to look at, say, if you're making an argument that imperialism was a cause, you look at Japanese invading Manchuria or the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, and that sort of attitude of imperialism being a major cause. If you're looking at the rise of Hitler, you'd want to look at the progress of many events, and then eventually Hitler becoming chancellor and how he did it and how his party won elections, and the economic instability and conditions that caused people to vote for Hitler, as well as the Treaty of Versailles causing a deep sense of dissatisfaction in a couple points in that treaty, including war reparations and accepting war guilt. Some people would have voted for the Nazi Party because of those reasons. All right, so on this timeline, there's the Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. So that's a super important event to set up sort of how the world is going to be aware of the anti-Semitism, the persecution of the Jewish people in Germany in Nazi Germany, before the war starts. And then you've got the invasion of Poland, and so that's a super important event there. Those are the ones that are going to be the most important for the lead up, but there are some other ones that are also really important. So let's go down here. If you're looking at the rise of the power of Nazis and Nazi Germany and Hitler, November 8th, 1923, Berthold Push is an important part of the story where Hitler eventually goes to prison for this insurrection and where he writes Mein Kampf. And this means that the world has access to his ideology, his ideas in his book that he wrote. The Nazis win more votes in 1932 because of destabilization and the economy in shambles. In 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor in a situation where his party is a large party, but they don't have a majority in the Reichstag. But they are a large party. And so some people will say Hitler was elected. Sometimes he'll say he was appointed. And so technically his party won votes, and then he was appointed to chancellor, to this position. February 1933, Reichstag fires. This is where Hitler uses this opportunity to consolidate power. And so this is in the story of his rise to power. And then 1934, June, the Night of the Long Knives. This is where Nazis kill Nazis. Nazis turn on disloyal Nazis to consolidate again Hitler's power. In particular, the leader of the SA is targeted. 1935, Nuremberg laws come in. So notice this one is really an important event. It's flag important. That means it's one of the ones that's most likely to be on the test. You should know how to give some examples of the Nuremberg laws for the test. And the Canadian connection is eventually going to come up in a later event where Jewish refugees are turned away from Canada, trying to get into Canada, But this gives evidence to how they were persecuted as early as 1935, which would have been knowledge in the media around the world. Okay. 1935 is also an important event, Italy invading Ethiopia. So this is an opportunity, a missed opportunity, where the Allies against sort of this imperialistic ideology could have said, hey, Italy, this is imperialistic. You shouldn't do this. This is not ethical. I make an ethical judgment and stand up to Italy. And if several of the superpowers of the world said, hey, this is not okay, they could have had the power at this point in time to stand up to Italy. And this would have sent a message to Hitler that this is not okay just to go around invading other countries. The problem was that both France and Britain were participating in colonialism, and therefore they were participating in this idea of colonizing Africa, as well as British had a colony in India, and the French had Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos as their colonies in Asia. The U.S. had control of the Philippines at this point in time. So this was a sense where it would be hypocritical for these countries to say, hey, what are you doing? Colonizing another country. So anyway, this is a missed opportunity to stop this ideology of colonialism and imperialism in 1935. 1936, Germany occupies the Rhineland. All right, this is again another missed opportunity where the Allies could have said, whoa, you're not allowed to do this. This is against the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty says you are not allowed to have a military force in this buffer zone. So they could have taken action at this point. Another missed opportunity. 1936 Summer Olympic Games in Nazi Germany. This is controversial, but the most important part is eventually the Canadian Prime Minister goes to Germany and meets with Hitler and other Nazi leaders. This is really important for the Canadian connection. And if you Google sort of Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie and Hitler, you will find that he was sort of at this point in time sympathetic or leaning towards wanting to be friends with Hitler and Nazis, depending on the source you read. But there is some sense where there's more evidence in his personal journals that he was at least anti-Semitic to the point of agreeing or being afraid of the population of Canada voting with anti-Semitism. Okay. 1938, Germany annexes Austria. That's a critical point, another point where the Allies could have said, wait a minute, this isn't okay. 1938, Night of Broken Glass, aka Kristallnacht. It's often referred as Kristallnacht, the German words. And this is a super important event. It was also on the other timeline, so you can assume that you're going to have a question about this on the test. What happened to Jewish businesses? What happened to the synagogues? Why is it called the Night of Broken Glass, aka windows were broken, so there's glass all over the street. And an important thing to note is that a lot of this had damaged Jewish-owned businesses, but there is some sense where sometimes there's mixed investors in these businesses. And so this is damaging the infrastructure of the entire country in a way. And so the Jews are fined for the damages for this event. And so this is a interesting persecution event that happens and gives a sort of a sense of awareness to the media of the world that Jews are being heavily persecuted in Germany. Okay, 1938, September, Sudetenland annexed by Germany, Munich Agreement. This is super important. This is the classic example of appeasement. And to understand the definition of appeasement, it's important to understand this example of the Sudetenland is land that belonged to Czechoslovakia, and it's where they had built their fortifications and their defenses in hilly lands. And so this was their plan to defend themselves from an invasion from Germany. To give away these hill fortifications to Germany without a fight. And the decision was made, of course, by the superpowers, France and Britain, without consultation with Czechoslovakia with the motto, peace in our time, with this sort of giveaway land in exchange for peace. This is sort of the classic argument that appeasement doesn't work. And so if somebody's making an argument that appeasement doesn't work and they're against appeasement, this is the classic argument of this story to make that argument. Okay, 1939, March, Germany invades and annexes the Czech provinces of Bohemia and Moravia. Okay, so Czechoslovakia is made up of a Czech zone area and a Slovak zone. And so this is basically the Western Czech area. The provinces of Bohemia and Moravia are being annexed by Germany, and this gives Germany a better position to eventually flank Poland when they invade Poland. Now we get to 1939, the big Canadian connection in the timeline. The most important one for the Canadian connection, and grade 10 socials is in particular about the Canadian connections and understanding the Canadian reaction to these global events. So, MS St. Louis was denied entry to Canada. And so this context of like why the leadership of Canada made this choice is in the context of all these other events in the timeline. They made this this decision to deny entry to refugees, even in light that the Night of the Broken Glass has already happened, even in light of the Nuremberg laws have already happened. And so it's important to know specifically that the Nuremberg laws and the Night of the Broken Glass has happened already. And the Canadian Prime Minister has already had a friendly meeting with Hitler and other Nazi leaders. And so when this event happens, it's in the context of all those previous events in the timeline. Eventually, Canada has done an apology on this event. This is a huge example of Canada turning away refugees and immigrants based on racism. Of course, it's not the only story of this. It's also connected to the story of the Komagata Maru, where South Asians were turned away from Canada, and it's also connected to the story of the Chinese head tax and the Asian Exclusion Act. So this is a story of Canada, and it was mixed though. The leadership of Canada and were concerned that the majority of people would not want this, but there were some people that were advocating that accepting these refugees would have been the right and ethical choice and decision. So it wasn't like 100% of Canadians were on board with this decision. Okay, Germany invades Poland. Important. Now this is important because it's where France and Britain say, okay, enough is enough. Germany, you've gone too far. You can't do this. We are saying no, and we're going to declare war on you. Two big things. One, they should have probably done this earlier, but even with all this going on, France and England were not really preparing a war plan. They were focused on trying to avoid war, do appeasement, and I guess connected to that, the Prime Minister of England on the side of appeasement is Neville Chamberlain. So you should be aware of that name, that he was promoting the appeasement agenda, and he was leading the United Kingdom, which is pretty much a major world power in leading the world in how to deal with this. And the Canadian Prime Minister is going along with being in the same team as Neville Chamberlain on the appeasement team. All right. And so when this happens, UK and France, they're very much in, we're hoping that appeasement is going to work. We are not creating a military-ready response to this hypothetical scenario. And so they're not ready. France and England are not ready. And so there is this sort of phony war where they declare war, but nothing happens. And this is, again, a huge missed opportunity for really not being ready. And that goes on to, I guess, the next story where Germany will eventually finish off with Poland and eventually get around to invading France. And France will fall quickly because they're not ready for with a plan of action that's going to solve this problem at this point in time. Okay, next, moving on. Key historical events. Japan invades Manchuria. Now, this is supposed to be a really fast review video, and so you can access the whole PowerPoint online, but I am going to just go through some of these slides just so you can see what you can access online. I've quickly talked about why you need to know about the beer hall push. There's the notes. There's the election notes, which you can access online. I'm going through this really fast, so you should be able, you can take the time to read these notes on the online PowerPoint, which could be also in PDF form on the Google Drive. You can also pause this at any point in time on the video to take a look at these slides, but because this is an ultra fast review session, I'm going to go through these slides really, really quickly. So a sizable portion of the parliament in Berlin went up in the Reichstag fires, and the Nazi Party took the opportunity to blame a communist and get rid of the democracy. So Hitler solidifies power. Hindenburg evoked Article 48, and the cabinet drew up the decree of the Reich President for the protection of the people and the state, abolished freedom of speech, assembly, privacy, and the press, legalized phone tapping, and interception of correspondence. So a huge Canadian connection to be aware of is Canada has had the War Measures Act, which has now been rewritten into the Emergencies Act, and to look at the stories of when the War Measure Act and the Emergencies Act have been used in Canada. And the purpose of that would be to be aware of the risk of Canada has in falling into a situation where democracy ends and freedom ends. And these are the freedoms that would end: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, privacy, freedom of the press, legalized phone tapping, interception of correspondence. Do we want that fate for Canada, or do we not want? We want the freedoms that we currently take for granted. Do we want them to continue? And so the global events often have a Canadian connection for Canadians to reflect on. Hitler solidifies power again when the president dies, Hindenburg. And here are some fascinating pictures of the world leaders. You should be aware of who these leaders are. And there is our Canadian Prime Minister with Nazis. And there is, from his journal, so Mackenzie King kept a diary, and that's where a lot of the evidence comes for his attitudes, his beliefs, his motivations, what he thought comes from his diary. Most likely you would think that someone is going to be relatively honest to their diary to some extent. At least they are going to be, it's going to be reliable to some level that it's their own thinking. Anyway, so he met with Göring. Göring eventually was tried at the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to death. So this just gives you an idea of sort of the perspective and bias of our Canadian Prime Minister. And I'll let you take a look at these notes on the PowerPoint on the Google Drive. Okay, Night of the Long Knives. This is a huge event. This is probably more of a 40% chance of being on a test or quiz. And you should know what the SA is and the brown shirts are and who Ernest Röhm was. Okay, so the brown shirts are basically an army of thugs or militia that are not very disciplined. They're loyal to Ernest Röhm, who's the leader of them, but they're not as loyal to Hitler as the SS. And so Hitler and Himmler are moving to consolidate their power with more loyal Nazis and getting rid of less loyal and less disciplined Nazis. That's a much longer story than that, but you should basically know that Ernest Röhm was killed in the Night of the Long Knives. Okay, key event, Nuremberg Laws. So you should be able to come up with a list of items in the Nuremberg Laws for the quiz. This is about 90% likely to be on the quiz or test. Okay, Jewish people were defined by having Jewish grandparents. So that would be 3 out of 4 of your grandparents are Jewish. Then you would be considered Jewish. There's many racist rules. Jews are excluded from citizenship. They're forbidden to intermarry with Germans. A red J stamp is required on ID cards. Nuremberg laws were expanded to other groups, and eventually the Nuremberg laws were expanded to include the Star of David and other rules as well. And then the Star of David is an example of a symbol. Okay, another key event, Italy invades Ethiopia. Now this is a really, really important event. It's really early on, and it's an example of both imperialism and colonialism, and it's an example of a missed opportunity where the world could have said, this is not okay, this is not ethical. Okay, the Rhineland. This is again about a 40% chance of being on the test, what happened in the Rhineland. And this is an example of a missed opportunity. The Anschluss. Germany troops annexing Austria. So you might have a question like, explain the Anschluss. Are you able to explain what happened? And the Western powers effectively do nothing. Now, they might say, oh, you shouldn't do that. But effectively, there's nothing really they do that's concrete. Okay, Night of the Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. This one is super important. This is, again, probably about 90% chance of being on the test. And you should be able to come up with some examples of these answers. This is effectively an answer key. You should be able to say, many synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses were vandalized, many Jews arrested, about 30,000, and 91 plus 200s dead. So some people mistake this as a mass execution event. This was more about breaking glass, which is why it gets the name the Night of the Broken Glass. So it's about windows being broken and trying to add fear and persecution. Okay, Kristallnacht. Key terms to remember. You should know the word demagoguery, and you should be able to define the word demagogue on the test. And the Sudetenland. Okay, so this one this is probably about 99% chance to be on the test. You should be able to explain that this is an example of appeasement. You should be able to define appeasement. You should be able to explain that it was the great powers that made this deal with Germany without the consultation with the Czechoslovakian government. In particular, the president of Czechoslovakia was the leader of Czechoslovakia was very upset by this, and he realized giving away our fortresses is so foolish that he basically resigned and left the country at that point in time. He's like, this is just ridiculous. But basically, the Canadian connection, William Lyon Mackenzie wanted this appeasement plan to work. He was optimistic and on the side of the appeasement policy of Neville Chamberlain. So you should know that Neville Chamberlain was a British Prime Minister at this point in time who was on the side of appeasement, and you should know that Winston Churchill opposed appeasement, and eventually Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister during World War II of the United Kingdom, aka England, aka Great Britain. Okay, Canadian connection point, MSLE St. Louis. We've also talked about this a little bit already. November 2000, members of the Canadian clergy gathered to apologize to 25 survivors. Baptist minister Doug Blair was among the clergymen who apologized. He's the great-nephew of Frederick Blair, who was the director of the Canadian Immigration Branch in 1939. I have a picture of my kids here. You might say, why is that there? It's just to remind me that this is one of the reasons why this is so important, so significant. I teach history because I don't want us to make the same mistakes. I want my kids to grow up in a safe country with freedoms and rights, and therefore it's important to remember these tragedies so that we don't repeat these kinds of mistakes. Event, invasion of Poland. ordered the invasion of Poland, Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland 1939. Now, one of the key events we've skipped over is sort of the treaty that Hitler made with the Soviet Union. And that is a whole big story, but because we haven't spent a lot of time on it, it's not likely to be on the test. But that would be sort of, if you are a student who is going for extending, you'd want to also Google the treaty between Hitler and the Soviet Union to have a non-aggression pact. And then, of course, that paper was eventually garbage in the sense that Hitler betrayed the Soviet Union and invaded them. And so that's really a good example of a garbage treaty that's not worth the paper it's written on. It's also important to note that something that's forgotten is the Soviet Union was an aggressor at this point, and they also invaded Poland. Okay, I'm going to go through this section really fast. You can go through these slides on your own, the PowerPoint, but the British Commonwealth Training Plan is a major Canadian contribution to the Battle of Britain. Canadians had a big role at Hong Kong. Canadians had a role in the Dieppe Raid, a huge role. This is probably one of their biggest, well, they had many big roles. Many big roles. Okay, Canadians in Italy, Canadians on D-Day. And another Canadian contribution is a Canadian lawyer. Humphreys was a contributor to the drafting process of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He thought it should belong to the whole world and didn't want to focus on him being recognized as an author, because then it would be more, if it's like, oh, a Canadian was the author, then it wouldn't necessarily belong to the whole world. But a Canadian had a role in that. Okay, terms you should study. If you don't know any of these terms, you should take some time to Google them. Conscription, totalitarianism, Führer, anti-Semitism, Holocaust. Okay, my student specifically asked me, what is the Holocaust? So this was something you should definitely know. This is probably a 90% chance of being on the test. The Holocaust refers to the genocide that the Nazis did against the Jewish people. It started off with bullets and then moved into death camps with using various types of gas. And it's a huge story. Everyone should fully understand the Holocaust and all the stages and steps that go towards that. If you're interested in knowing more about this topic, you should Google the 10 stages of genocide and the concentration camps. Okay, I guess also in the term Holocaust, you should know that it was carried out by the SS, and you should know that Himmler was in charge of the SS, and Heydrich was hired by Himmler and given the responsibility to come up with the idea of the final solution, where he fleshed it out at the Wannsee Conference, and he was the chair of the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution, meaning specifically that they're going to kill the Jewish people rather than try to get them out of the country. And so originally, up until this point, the Nazis were trying to just persecute the Jews so they would leave and flee and go to other countries. Scapegoat, Night of the Long Knives, Nuremberg Laws, Kristallnacht, Gestapo. This is a secret police force. A Canadian identity. You should be aware that Canadian identity keeps growing during World War I and World War II, in a sense of Canadian pride in Canadian actions, in a sense that Canadians are separate from the British Empire. And so that is one of the society changes of Canada. We talked about appeasement. Oh, there's Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. That's one of the things that we haven't talked much about yet, but it's there as a term you should know. Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, Battle of Britain is where Britain uses airplanes to defend itself from the Nazi Air Force, which the Nazis need to destroy the British Air Force before they could attempt a amphibious naval invasion of Britain. Because Britain still has an Air Force, they have to sort of cancel or delay or indefinitely delay that idea. The Dieppe raid, we talked about that Canadians had a key role in this raid. A debatable question is was this a good idea or a bad idea? And so you should be able to make an argument. I think that the Dieppe raid was a good idea or a bad idea because, and answer that question, and that has probably a 50% chance of being on the test. Battle of the Atlantic and U-boat convoys probably has about a 30% chance of being on the Atlantic, and this is a big Canadian contribution where Canadians provide convoys to protect ships from being destroyed by submarines. Political ideologies. You should know fascism and communism and be able to give a definition of each. Devil's Brigade. You should know that this is an elite joint U.S.-Canadian unit, and it included Tommy Price, Canadian First Nations Ojibwe. Vandus. You should know this is a French-Canadian unit. Oops, something happened there. Operation Overlord, Juno Beach, Pearl Harbor, Manhattan Project, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Probably number 6 is probably the most likely to be on the test. You should be able to make an argument whether it was justified to drop nuclear bombs on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. You should be able to explain what is the War Measures Act and how it compares to what happened in Nazi Germany. You should be able to define the Holocaust, genocide, and the term final solution, which means basically a genocide of the Jewish people, killing them, extermination, versus trying to get them to leave the country. Japanese internment. This is a huge Canadian story. You should be aware of this. This sort of relates to this War Measures Act one here, where it's like, because Canada can take away people's rights during the time of war, these Japanese people lost their rights. They went to sometimes forced labor camps, and they lost their property. And after the war ended, they were not given their property back. Okay. A little aside with that, a lot of them owned things like fishing boats, which were very valuable. And some of my ancestors were Norwegian fishermen. And so the Norwegian fishermen ancestors I have would have fished alongside these Japanese fishermen. And so that is a story that is, I guess, close to my extended family. And Canadian Women's Army Corps. That's an important story. You should definitely know about the role of women. All right. Lend-Lease Act. That's a U.S. way of providing support. Propaganda, British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, National Resource Mobilization. On this list, I see St. Louis incident. This is probably the most likely one to be on the test, number 7. Yalta is probably the second most likely to be on the test. Then probably the third most likely would be Potsdam. So if you're going to review this list, St. Louis, Yalta, and Potsdam are most likely to be on the test. On this list, number 9, Japanese internment, Holocaust, War Measures Act, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those ones are probably the most likely on this list to be on the test. And on this list, appeasement, Dieppe raid, political ideologies, and Devil's Brigade, and Tommy Price, Canadian Ojibwe. Okay, keep going on. On this list, what's likely to be on the test? Oh, the bold ones. Okay, we got Tommy Prince again, so that's likely. You should know who he is. Who was he? What did he do? William Lyon Mackenzie King. So he won 11 wards. He was a First Nation Ojibwe soldier who won 11 wards. You should be able to write that down on the test. Okay, Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. Winston Churchill. F.D. Roosevelt, Neville Chamberlain. You need to know that he was on the side of appeasement, and Winston Churchill was against appeasement. Roosevelt, there's a lot of stuff to know about him. He's really important to know about him, but at the same time, this is more for Social Studies 10, so he is more likely to be a huge focus in 20th century history 12. But from the Canadian perspective, probably knowing our Prime Minister, our First Nation soldier, and then our Canadian connection to the British Prime Ministers is more important for the Canadian connections. And then John Peters Humphrey, the Canadian lawyer and contributor to the Universal Declaration of Rights. Since he's Canadian, that's an important Canadian connection to know. Eleanor Roosevelt is again going to come probably more in the 20th century history, but she was also a major leader force of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And these three over here, you should know in terms of understanding fascism. Okay, you should also be able to explain what is conscription and why was conscription so divisive in Canada and why French Canadians did not really like the idea of conscription. Force 136. Well, this has probably got a 40% chance of being on the test, but you should know that there were Chinese Canadian soldiers involved. This is not in the textbook. This was a top secret force. Tehran Conference. Probably about a 20% chance of being on the test. This one is important in terms of basically Mackenzie's advocating for Canadians to be recognized as Canadians, which is about Canadian identity. We're not just part of the British Empire. Anything else we need to know? Women started to get more rights. Oh yes, this one could be on the test. You need to know why women got more rights, because they were needed in the workplace during World War II. Minorities in Canada started to get more civil rights after World War II, partly because of their contribution to the war effort, partly because the world realized how awful racism was after the world saw the news stories of what happened in Nazi Germany. But there was also a lot of people working together of all different races in an army that was more merit-based, at least more, somewhat more merit-based than other places. Canadian identity had evolved to be more independent from Britain. So this is a huge part of how society has changed. Okay, so another question the student asked is, what do we need to know about the Canadian Charter of Rights? Every Canadian has the rights to live without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical ability. This was added in 1982 to our Constitution, and it's an example of how Canada was changing. In particular, no discrimination based on race, nation, ethnic origin, and religion are also embedded into the definition of the crime of genocide. And so this definitely relates to the Holocaust, that we have these rights not to face discrimination on these areas. And so this sort of connects to the rights the Jewish people did not have in Nazi Germany and the rights that we enjoy today in Canada. And I guess the key thing is those rights are how we would avoid a tragedy like that coming to Canada in the future. So it's important to protect those rights in Canada going forward. Holocaust, and recognize how we got them in the past. Holocaust, page 152 in your textbook. You should be able to answer on your test if you get a question like, what is the Holocaust? The anti-Semitic and racist views of Hitler and Nazi government were well known in the 1930s. By 1941, the Nazi government adopted the final solution, a horrifying plan of genocide. So the Holocaust is a horrifying plan of genocide. It evolved over time. It started off with bullets, but then evolved into death camps in gas chambers. Another question a student asked about was what were the Nuremberg trials? And in 1945, the Allies established an international military tribunal in Nuremberg, Germany, to prosecute prominent Nazi leaders and many atrocities after the war. I'm going to let you go through the rest of these slides on your own on the PowerPoint, but these are really important. And the Japanese internment. End of the winter review session. And there's some outtakes, recommended videos there. I'm just going to go really slowly over these outtakes so that you can pause on any of these outtakes. And that is the end. Good luck studying for the test. Study, study, study. If you have any questions, ask 3 friends and then send me a message on chat if you still don't have an answer, or send me an email.